68. This is the Field of 68 bracketology show. We are, of course, presented by Bet Rivers. It's a Monday edition. It's conference tournament week. This is the first edition of the show with real, actual bids punched. Oh, it feels good. I'm your host today. I am Jim Root of the Three Man Weave. I'm joined by Jonathon Warriner, the podcaster and bracketologist extraordinaire from Making the Madness, and Lukas Harkins, the writer and bracketologist over at Heat Check College Basketball. Two terrific bracketology minds, folks. We're going to dig into some nitty gritty here on this show. Fellas, I wanted to start out with a question about conference tournaments because I think everybody has turned their attention to college basketball for this week. It's the start of the real craziness. We get the big tournaments at the end of this week, leading into Selection Sunday. And everybody wants to form narratives about who needs to win a game to get in. And if they lose a game, they're out. It all comes down to this week. Jonathon, let's start with you. How much do these 1 out of 30 games actually matter for these teams in terms of both selection and seeding? How are you viewing some of these games this week?
Yeah, I'm viewing it as 1 out of 30 games. Like it is 3.333% of the team's resume. And look, I mean, to this point, like a lot of teams, they're very close when it comes to, the bubble. You've got certain teams, right next to each other and kind of like a little bit of a tier. And I think this week can be used as like a good separator. And especially if a team, let's say a Rutgers makes a run and wins the Big Ten or makes it to the Big Ten championships or something like that goes along, or Wyoming makes a run, like that can be used as a way to, take a team from off the bubble to in the NCAA tournament. And on the other side, there's probably not quite the amount of losses. I guess certain teams could take a couple bad losses in their conference tournaments, but at the end of the day, I think for the most part, unless they're just, these bubble teams are winning conference championships left and right, every team's going to lose.
Yeah. All right. So Lukas, where do you stand? I mean, like, can these teams really move the needle? Is it kind of a case by case basis? Like, for instance, off the top of my head, we've got that Michigan, Indiana game. Are you looking at these games as like, all right, I'm going to take a big conclusion away from this, or like Jonathon, is it kind of more incremental and you don't want to overreact to one result?
I think it's a mix. I think it's incremental, but also on a case-by-case basis. Like, for example, if you look at AAC teams, so if you look at SMU sitting around the bubble, like they have a higher chance of taking a bad loss than, say, a team like Notre Dame or Michigan in bigger conferences with higher net rated teams. So I think that it's incremental in that they're 1 of 30 games, then that should be taken as such. The games in November mean just as much as the games now in bracketology standing. And the other thing I'll say is the timing of the games. I think people get a little bit too worked up on semis and championship games to an extent. The committee's probably done with most of its work by Saturday. I think Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are the games that matter most, especially for those teams in the bubble, because you look at a team, for example, like Xavier, that gets a first round matchup that would be a bad loss on an early day in the week. So I think what matters more is those early Wednesday, Thursday, Friday games than if you get to Saturday or Sunday.
I think I've had multiple instances in the past of when I've been bracketing, I'll react to a Saturday night result and be like, oh, I better move them up a seed line. It's just like, no, I don't think they're ready to make that kind of a move. I think the committee has said they haven't slotted to locations or anything by that point, but they don't want to mess with their S curve too much at that stage, just because, again, it is only one game and it shouldn't be overreacted to at that point. So I think that's a good message for people that maybe are looking at this week ready to take away some crazy conclusions of like, all right, they're in or they're out based on this one game. It doesn't happen that way. I know maybe not as many people were watching college hoops back in November, but those games matter just the same on the team sheet to the committee. It is important to remember that even if someone's playing well or playing poorly right now, you got to evenly weight everything, including these conference tournament games. All right, let's get into some of the essentials. We got to talk 1 seeds, and we'll get into the bubble. Not a ton of movement on the 1 line. So I'm going to see where you guys have your 4 1 seeds. I think every one of the teams is really in contention for a 1 seed 1 over the weekend, which is a good sign for them. Lukas, let's start with you with your 4 1 seeds in order. Where do you land on those?
So my 4 ones right now are Gonzaga, Baylor, Arizona, and Auburn. And I think to your point of these teams all won over the weekend, I think we've now shrunk to, I think, 6 teams really in contention for a 1 seed. And these are 4 of those 6.
Okay. Jonathon, what about you? Which 4 did you end up on?
I end up with the same 4, same order as well. I have Gonzaga as my number 1 overall seed. I still think, I mean, if they drop a game, I still think they're going to be a 1 seed, maybe not number 1 overall, but I think they're comfortably there. Baylor's my number 2 overall, Arizona number 3, and then Auburn just slightly taking that last spot. But I think that last spot is certainly up for grabs. When you have Big 12 and SEC tournaments are ultimately, I think, going to be kind of deciding factors in that.
Yeah, so I guess we'll get this out of the way. Lukas, you implied it's down to 6. Jonathon, do you agree? And I guess the question then, did Duke get eliminated by losing at home to North Carolina from the 1 seed conversation?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. They are out. Lukas also nodded. No more Duke talk for 1 seeds, folks. It's just not going to happen. These teams can't lose enough. But so Lukas, who's right outside that picture? You had Auburn as the last one. I believe it's going to be Kansas and Kentucky. Are those the 2 that could get there?
Yeah, and I have those swapped on my S-curve right now. I have Kentucky at number 5 overall, Kansas at number 6. The committee made a point at the bracket preview with regards to Illinois and Wisconsin that head-to-head matter. If your head-to-head records matter if you're right next to each other on the S-curve, and Kentucky has that great win at Kansas. So that's the difference there. But I think all of those teams are really close. I mean, you look at Kentucky, Auburn, Kansas as my 4, 5, 6 in that order. One of Auburn and Kentucky has to lose. Neither of those teams can go undefeated before Selection Sunday, so I think you're going to see a little bit of shakeup, at least there. And the same can be said for Kansas and Baylor, though I think Baylor is in much better position to stay on the 1 line than Auburn is. Yeah,
Jonathon, let me ask you this, because I look at Baylor's resume and I'm impressed. I mean, they've done a lot right this year. They lead the country in Q1 and Q2 wins. How much are they a threat to actually get up to that number 1 overall spot? Let's say them and Gonzaga both win out. Can Baylor pass Gonzaga for that number 1 overall seed?
I think the committee kind of put a point of emphasis on, having Gonzaga number 1 overall, just kind of because of they were so efficient early in the season. And I think it's going to be hard without Gonzaga losing in the WCC tournament for Baylor to pass them. Certainly they will have a, great resume, but I think at the end of the day, if Gonzaga wins these 2 games in the WCC tournament, I think they're going to be the number 1 overall seed. But hey, for Baylor, I mean, you'll take being the number 2 overall seed if that's what it comes to, because we just saw what happened last year. So, I mean, not the worst thing in the world to be the number 2 overall seed.
Right. And the path will still basically be the same in terms of geography, where they go, whether they're 2 overall or 1 overall. Lukas, one more question. Can Arizona pass Gonzaga for the 1 seed in the West? If you get a Gonzaga loss plus Arizona wins the Pac-12 tournament, is there a scenario where Arizona takes that 1 in the West and Gonzaga gets bumped out of there?
I don't think so. I think the committee made that pretty clear with Gonzaga's advantage in quality metrics going into the bracket preview, and that's pretty much stayed. I think if anyone's going to leap Gonzaga for the 1 spot, it's Baylor. But I think the big difference for Gonzaga right now is, unlike other years in the WCC, it's going to be hard to catch them. They're probably going to finish with San Francisco and then St. Mary's, both of which are tournament quality teams, probably both single-digit seed quality teams. It's not like going through some of those weaker WCC tournament teams like they have in the past. So they're going to add both of those games are quad 1 wins if they win both of them, and I don't think they're going to be able to be catchable if they win those 2.
Quad 1A at that too.
Yeah. I mean, San Francisco has risen up into that top 25 region. Really, really impressive stuff by them. So yeah, that makes it more difficult for Gonzaga, unless they lose by 40 points, which I don't see Gonzaga losing by 40, considering the tempo St. Mary's plays at and everything. But yeah, okay. So that cleans up that discussion. It's relatively neat. It's coming down to the wire here. There's a lot less movement that can happen just because we are 6 days from Selection Sunday. So let's turn to the bubble. There's a lot going on there. It was actually a fairly solid weekend for the bubble, both in terms of some teams getting huge wins, looking at you, Michigan and North Carolina, and even Memphis. And then also the bubble did not shrink. Murray State took care of business. Loyola took care of business. whether Loyola would have been or allowing a bid stealer is up for debate, but no longer. It's not up for debate because it can't happen. So Jonathon, let's start with your last four in. We'll see who's sneaking into the tournament. We'll get Lukas's, and then we'll discuss how we feel about that part of the bracket. So who do you have, Jonathon?
All right. So my fourth to last team in is the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Decent metrics. They have that Kentucky win, which is certainly aged well, but this team I think is far from a lock. And I mean, if they take an early ACC tournament loss, they could be in a position where they end up falling on the wrong side of the bubble. The Wyoming Cowboys as my third to last team in. They've kind of struggled a little bit down the stretch, but I still think if they're able to get to that Mountain West semifinal game, I think they'll be in a good position to make it. But they take an early loss in their conference tournament, maybe they end up on the wrong side of the bubble. Wake Forest is kind of a team, and we've discussed it in the past with that non-con strength of schedule. They only have one quadrant one win. Not an overly impressive resume overall, but just kind of sneaking in at this moment. And then my last team in is SMU. This is still a team that overall, has that good Houston win, has the Memphis sweep, but just not an overwhelmingly great resume, but just enough to get them on the right side of the cut line for now.
Yeah, for some context in the ACC, Notre Dame likely facing Virginia Tech, which is certainly a losable game. They'll likely be an underdog in that game, to be honest. Yeah. So that makes that difficult. Wake Forest has a bad loss chance with the winner of Pitt or Boston College. Need to take care of business there, and then have a game with Miami that could be a play-in type of situation. All right, Lukas, where did you stand with your last four in?
So my last four in as of today are Xavier, SMU, VCU, and Notre Dame. In that order, I think Xavier is a team that's in better shape than those other three, with 9 quad 1 and 2 wins. They do have a quad 3 loss, and their metrics have dropped a bit. They have a must-win game this week. They get Butler in their first game of the Big East tournament, which would qualify as a bad loss for them. SMU, I think, I've talked about this in the past, really screams bubble team. 5-5 in quads 1 and 2, has a quad 3 loss, quad 4 loss. All of their metrics are between 40 and 50, except their Ken Pom. They're pretty solidly, I think, right on the cut line. VCU with a tough loss this weekend. I know I've talked at length about VCU this year, and I think they're a team that falls closer to the cut line because of bad quality metrics compared to the rest of the bubble. But I think their resume metrics, 28th in KPI, 39th in strength of record, that should warrant selection in my opinion. So I think they'll probably get in, but be close to the cut line. But they have to play well at the A10 tournament to make that happen. Notre Dame, Jonathon already talked about, pretty underwhelming overall resume, 4-8 in quads 1 and 2. An 11-1 quad 3 record is good, but it's for a team that really doesn't have much quality on it. Sub 47 in both resume and quality metrics. I think they're right around that last four in, first four out, probably closer than anybody else to cut line.
Yeah, SMU, they're looking at probable matchup with Wichita State in the quarterfinals. Can't lose that one. And then you get that potential semifinal with Memphis. That would really be a big one for particularly the Ponies, because it felt like Memphis did a great job of sweeping Houston and ascending more into a comfortable territory. They've kind of been a recurring character in our last four in, first four out reveals, but they look like they're above that level at this point. Jonathon, I want to go back to Wyoming real quick. You've got them in that last four in. They play UNLV in the quarterfinals. This is a tricky one because I looked last year at the team sheets, and the games with UNLV in the tournament counted as neutral, but it's actually like you're playing a road game at UNLV. How does that work? Lukas, you're nodding. So that confirmation, right? It does count as a neutral game.
I believe that's the case. That's what it looked like last year. I think that's difficult to deal with for sure, but I think that is what it's listed as.
That's tough because that should be like you're playing a true road game in a tournament. But can Wyoming survive that game against UNLV if they take a loss there? How do you feel about the Cowboys after that?
Yeah, I mean, I still think if they take that loss, it's not necessarily a bad loss. It's a Q2 loss, I believe. UNLV still in that top 100, I believe. Yep. So, I mean, barely, but I mean, I still think they can take that. I mean, they'd move up to 80. They'll be basically the same rating as Rutgers is right now. So, I mean, not a horrible loss by any means, but I still think they could probably take that and still end up on the right side of the bubble. But certainly, bid stealers are out there. If let's say they take that loss and they're the second to last team in, and all of a sudden you get Oregon and Dayton stealing bids. I mean, you can go from being on the right side of the bubble to being on the wrong side of the bubble. So it's always tough to be on the bubble, especially when you have the potential for these bid stealing conferences.
Yep. The message is, of course, just win, baby. Just win, Wyoming, and you will feel a lot better. All right, Lucas, Jonathon just mentioned them. They just mentioned the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. It's a team we're going to discuss. So let's get your first four out. I have an inkling. I have a hunch that maybe Rutgers will appear there. So let's get to that four and start having that discussion. Who do you have in your first four out?
So my first four out start with those Scarlet Knights. Rutgers first out, followed by Dayton, that has kind of creeped back up there, even with 4 quad, 3-4 losses. They're potentially in that mix if they make a deep run in the A10. Their metrics are pretty close to being on that cut line. I think that there's a pretty distinct cut line between my number 69 and number 70 right now. Rutgers, I think, is pretty far ahead of these other 3. Florida is still in the mix. Lost to Kentucky this weekend. 6-11 in quads 1 and 2, 1 quad 4 loss. I think they're probably in the first 4 out, but if you compare them to a team like Xavier, who I have in my last 4 in, they have very similar resumes, except Xavier has 3 more quad 1 and 2 wins. I think that kind of puts into comparison how far away some of these teams might be the further we get down the bubble. But the SEC is ripe with opportunities. And if Florida makes a run, they're in the mix. And I think the same can be said about Indiana, Big Ten. Great opportunity for them to pick up wins in the conference tournament. They already have quality metrics that seem to indicate they're a team that should make the tournament. Resume metrics would be the lowest to make the tournament by a significant margin within the last 2 years. But I think those are the teams that are really sitting there. And I think Rutgers is definitely the closest to the field. And they're a really tough battle. And they remind me a lot of the St. John's team from 2019, sitting down with low metrics, low net, that made the field. And it wouldn't shock me if they made the field at all.
All right, we're going to circle right back to Rutgers in a second, but I should have asked you, with your last 4 in, how many do you feel like are truly very close to falling out of the field, or what's the safety level, I guess, of each of your last 4 ins? Jonathon, let me ask you first there.
Yeah, I mean, with VCU, I think they're the most safe of the 4 that I have in. I guess they could theoretically take a bad loss early in the Atlantic 10 tournament, but I feel pretty confident they're going to at least make the semifinals, which I think at that point, I mean, they have the resume metrics are just off the charts for a bubble team, and I think at that point, I mean, I would say VCU, they shouldn't feel safe. I think they're the most safe of these teams. I certainly think Notre Dame is, we've talked about the ACC tournament. Notre Dame, Wyoming, Wake Forest, they're all in danger. You certainly have SMU could take a horrible loss. So of those are my last 5 in, and I think of those teams, like I would say the ACC schools and maybe SMU are the least safe of them.
Okay, Lucas, what about you? How many spots do you feel like are really up for grabs in your field?
I think there's that gap between my first team out, Rutgers, and my second team out being Dayton right now. I think any of those teams can be in the mix. I think from probably Wyoming, who's my second 11, through Rutgers, I think those teams are competing for the same number of spots -1. I think that's probably my grouping. So Wyoming, Davidson, Wake Forest, Xavier, SMU, VCU, Notre Dame, and Rutgers are those teams kind of in the mix. I think I agree with Jonathon. I've hyped VCU up a lot with their resume metrics, and I think the same can be said for Davidson. As a note on that, only 3 teams in the last 2 tournaments have missed an at-large with resume metrics better than 45, and no one has missed with resume metrics better than 36. VCU currently sits at 33.5, and Davidson is in the same mix with 37. I think that those teams are probably the safest because the closer you get to the cut line, I think the more the committee will value having stronger resume metrics, and those teams are in there. I look at SMU as probably the most prototypical bubble team. I think they have one of the when I look at teams closer to the cut line and even closer to seed line jumps, I try to, when I'm projecting the committee, think with who has the most foolproof case for a bid, and SMU doesn't have has right across the board nets in the top 50, resume metrics in the top 45, quality metrics in the top 50. They have 2 quad 1A wins. They check a lot of boxes. They don't exceed expectations in any of them, but I think they meet in a lot. And I think we could see them getting into the field just because they don't really have anything that's glaringly obvious for taking them out of selection.
Hang the banner, SMU. Most bubbly 2022.
I think for sure.
I want that in the rafters.
Bubble champion of the year.
Yes. It's a classic game of musical chairs, it sounds like. There's, like Lukas said, there's one less chair available than the team's really dancing by that cut line.
Exactly. That's how I feel about it too.
Yep. All right, Jonathon, I don't think we've gotten your first 4 out yet. So let's take a peek at those 4 and see if there's any teams we want to really dig into.
All right. Well, Rutgers is the loser of the musical chairs, as we say here. I mean, with this Rutgers team, I'm impressed by the wins they have, but at the end of the day, their metrics as a whole are not good. Like 76 in the net, no team inside or outside the top 75 has ever gotten it at large bid. I think St. John's, you mentioned it earlier, at 73 was the lowest team ever, and they probably shouldn't have gotten in that year. And even with that St. John's team, I went back and looked at it. I mean, they still rated in KPI, which was one of the metrics. They rated 40th in that. So, I mean, this Rutgers team, their highest metric is strength of record. That is 50th. They're 57th in KPI. Obviously analytical based metrics don't like this team either. So, I mean, it's hard for me to, think about including a team that is not even top 50, or they're top 50 in one metric and it's 50th spot. I just think with their overall resume metrics, they're going to end up being on the wrong side of the bubble because, I mean, theoretically there's 36 at large spots. You say like 10 go to conference champions. I mean, you're not a positive on any of the resume metrics or analytical metrics. So I think they're on the wrong side of the bubble. And then once you get to 70 through 72 with Indiana, Oklahoma, Florida, I think this is kind of what I call the play your way in tier of teams. Like Indiana currently on the wrong side of the bubble. They win 2 games. They go out, they beat Michigan, they beat Illinois. I think they can play their way onto the right side of the bubble. Oklahoma, I mean, they play a must-win game against Baylor. They win that. Maybe they win another game, get to the Big 12 championship. I think they could, potentially play their way into the field. Bad, quad 1 record, but they could, potentially, if they make a run in the Big 12 tournament, make a run here. And then Florida is another team. Like they've got a tough game. I think they probably need to win 3 games in the SEC tournament to potentially, make a run. Like they're going to play Auburn in the second round. I don't think beating Auburn just twice is going to be enough, but if let's say they go out, they win their first game, I think against Texas A&M, then they play Auburn, they beat them. Then let's say they play Arkansas or LSU and they beat them, they could potentially move in. But I think the gap from 69 to 70 it's a real legitimate gap.
Okay. So Lukas, let me ask you then about Rutgers and metrics, kind of a more overarching question here. If you removed metrics, I think Rutgers is a lock. Like just if you look at the wins that they've gotten. So the question then becomes, how much do you think those metrics should matter? And if we were not talking about them and we're looking at look at what Rutgers has done, they've beaten so many good teams in the Big Ten. Do you feel like, and this is excluding the committee and the way they've done it and predicting it, do you feel like those wins should be more important than some of the metrics, or do you think they're a good objective way of measuring these teams and not getting emotional and caught up in some of that stuff? How do you feel about that kind of debate?
Yeah, I think in a case-by-case basis, I think a lot of people can make the argument that we look too far into metrics. I'm not opposed to that argument, but I think in the grand scheme of things, they do a pretty good job, especially I think now when you have 6 team sheet metrics that you're going to have less an opportunity. You'll see more of those outliers more clearly as the committee, if one number is definitely off compared to the rest. And I think there's enough of a sample size with 6 to kind of draw conclusions from. I think the biggest deal about it is you're able to draw comparisons between a team like Rutgers, which has had 18 opportunities against quad one or two opponents, compared to with teams that don't have that many opportunities. And I think as much as the argument in favor of Rutgers is that they have 6 quad one wins, 4 in quad 1A, and they're 9-9 in quad 1 and 2, they're also just 9-3 in quads 3 and 4. Which I think if you compare to bubble teams that have had all those kinds of opportunities, like a VCU who's 15-1 against quad 3 and 4, like they've played all those games, they've beaten all those teams. I think that it's a valuable tool to look at metrics, be able to compare teams that just don't have even schedules, and more importantly, don't have even scheduling opportunities. Yes. No one's going to want to go play at VCU. No one wants to go play at Dayton. There are games that you lose. Quite frankly, it's not easy to go play in the Siegel Center. Like that's a tough game to play. I think that there's value in looking at the metrics in that way, to not only even up schedules, but even up the scheduling opportunities that are available. And with regards to Rutgers, they are the anti-SMU in terms of resume.
I really like the way you put that, where we can't measure how difficult winning some of the quad 3 games and going, however, like almost undefeated in them, versus playing a bunch of quad 1 games like Oklahoma and Florida have and not winning those. So it is nice to have something that kind of centers you and lets you see the whole picture, all 30 games, a metric like that, rather than if you're just looking at the Q1 and Q2 stuff, you're not paying attention to all 30 games. You're not giving them equal weight. So I think it's important to have both of those on there. I like that answer, Lucas. Well done. I'm gonna give you a clap here. All right, let's go to some specific teams, guys. We covered Rutgers. We covered the bubble. There's a couple others further up the seed list that I think are worth discussing. Let's start with Illinois, and then also at the same time we can kind of discuss Wisconsin. But we're going to the Big Ten, top of the Big Ten, the 1 and the 2 seed. Both of these teams have injury considerations that you got to try to figure out how to factor in. The committee certainly mentioned it, Jonathon. They talked about Illinois' issues that they've had. How do you feel about Illinois right now? And how much does winning the Big Ten, having the championship, having the 1 seed, how much does that matter to you? And how much do you think it matters to the committee?
Yeah, I mean, for both these teams, I think it certainly is a major advantage for both these teams. Right now, I have Wisconsin slightly higher, but again, like the committee also has mentioned that they are going to take injuries into account. I could see a situation where the committee, like if they're deciding that between the two teams, ends up going with Illinois, have them 12th and 13th on my respective seed list. So yeah, in terms of these two teams, I think they're very, very close between the two. Wisconsin, I think, certainly has the better resume, but of course, with their analytical metrics, I mean, they're certainly down lower on the seed list. Whereas, like Illinois, they're really good, really consistent. Like they've got an average 15.5 in terms of resume metrics and an average of 16 in quality metrics. So between those two, I think it's very close between the two, and it will be kind of a test case to where the committee is looking at. If they're looking at, whether it's overall body of work or whether they're looking kind of at the Q1, Q2 type records. If, this obviously selection show is still a week away from happening, but if, let's say both teams go to the same round and lose in like the Big Ten semifinals, I think you're going to get a very interesting case study between the two.
Yeah, Lucas, I was surprised, I think, by having the committee having Illinois ahead of Wisconsin in the reveal a couple weeks back. Do you think that has held still? Do you still have Illinois above them, or has Wisconsin done enough to pass up the Illini? Where do you have these two on the S-curve?
Yeah, I thought Wisconsin was ahead of Illinois at the bracket preview. It turned out I was wrong. I think they moved ahead relatively recently, and then after yesterday's loss to Nebraska, they're right back where they were in the bracket preview for me. I have Illinois 12th overall, last 3 seed, Wisconsin 13th overall, first 4 seed, and I think that this kind of brought me back to the bracket preview a bit. I still think personally I would have Wisconsin ahead of Illinois. However, when I'm looking at projecting the committee, going back to the bracket preview where they had Illinois 12, Wisconsin 13, since then both teams are 4-1. Wisconsin's average net win is 57. Illinois' average net win 45 over those 5 games. Illinois' only loss was at home to net number 20. Wisconsin's only loss was at home to net 138. I think you can certainly make the argument that Illinois has performed better since the bracket preview and was already rated ahead. And I think that is worth it. And not to mention that if they're back-to-back on the seed line like they have them right now, Illinois has the head-to-head victory, which I think is contributing to that. I think both certainly have an argument to be on the 3 seed. And I think that you could see maybe a team like Texas Tech falling closer to the 4. But right now I have Wisconsin as my first 4 and Illinois as my last 3. And I don't think either of them are in danger of falling out of the top 16.
Boom, bangs gavel. Wisconsin is behind Illinois. The case has been made, folks. You cannot refute that. That was tremendous logic. As much as you'd like to, I think refuting it would be a futile exercise. All right, let me talk one more other Big Ten team while we're here. Let's talk Iowa, and that'll segue into a Houston discussion. And the chat kind of mentioned it too. But Jonathan, let's talk Iowa because they do sort of lack some of the top line wins. The resume doesn't stack up with some of their Big Ten brethren like Illinois, like Wisconsin, but their analytics, their quality metrics are really, really high. They've played a lot better of late. Where do you land on the Hawkeyes at this point in the seeding process?
Yeah, I had them as my last 6 seed. It was kind of a toss up between them and Alabama for that last 6 seed, but I mean, certainly you look at this team performance wise. I mean, they're one of the toughest teams to play in the country right now. And we saw it last night when they played at Illinois. They, for a good portion of the game, they were taking it to Illinois and, ultimately Illinois makes the comeback. But with this Iowa team, they're going to be, tough out in the Big Ten tournament. I wouldn't be surprised to see them, get a couple wins and maybe move up a little bit in the seed order. But at the end of the day, like right now, you can't, validate having them as like a top 5 seed. I have them as a 6. I certainly think like you could have them as a 7 seed. I wouldn't go, 8, 9. That'd probably be relatively unfair to the 1 seeds there. But yeah, I think this Iowa team, they certainly passed the eye test, and it'll just be about whether they can get some wins here. If, they could potentially get a rematch against Illinois, they could get Michigan. They play Rutgers, of course. If they're able to, make a run and get to the Big Ten championship, I could see them moving up a seeds line here and there.
Yep. And the other one in that discussion with the lack of the top end wins, but some really great metrics, is Houston. They're almost like the anti-Rutgers in the sense where the top of the resume looks a little blank, but man, the metrics are really strong. And seeding them is tough because if you put them further down the line, if you make them like a 7 seed, they're going to be favored over a 2 seed in the second round. Like it's really tough to do that to a 2 seed. And that's why I think you have to use some of the predictive metrics as part of your seeding process. So Lukas, what do you think about Houston right now? They just got blown out at Memphis. Everybody saw it. There's a little bit of shade being thrown the Cougars' way because they don't have a Q1 win. What do you make of the Cougars right now?
They do have 1 Q1 win, I believe.
I
believe they're 1-4.
Oklahoma State.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There we go. The Cowboys snuck in there.
Over NCAA ineligible Oklahoma State. No, I think with Houston, I think you bring these 2 teams up at a good time. I think Houston and Iowa are 2 of the more comparable teams in the middle of the seed area. I have Iowa as my first 6. I have Houston as my last 5. I think if you look at it kind of tighter, both teams have way better quality metrics than they have predictive metrics. Than they have way better quality metrics than they do resume metrics. With Houston clearing Iowa in both of those categories. Houston obviously doesn't have 2 quad 1A wins like Iowa does. However, Houston's 8-5 in quads 1 and 2. Iowa's 8-9. And I think we talked about this a little bit earlier with the value of winning quad 3 and 4 games. I think it's very easy to throw out quad 4 victories. But being 10-0 in quad 3 is easier said than done. Just ask Duke, who's 9-1. Just ask Wisconsin, who has a quad 3 loss too. I mean, there are teams there. I think there is some value that's overlooked in playing that many games against quad 3 and actually winning all of them. Houston is 17-1 in quad 2 and 3 games, which is why their metrics are so high. And I think it's easy to get lost in. They only have 1 quad 1 win, but we have resume metrics on the team sheet for a reason, and they're 15th and 17th in KPI and strength of record. I think that they're probably in the mix for a top 6 seed, regardless. I think there was a good argument for them the committee may be overvaluing quality metrics of the bracket preview, but they did not include Houston, and I don't think they will include Houston in the top 16 in a week either. I think the Cougars are pretty locked into a 5 or 6, and I think I'd be surprised if they fell anywhere other than that.
Yeah, Jonathan, what about you on Houston? Because you had the tweet yesterday that kind of got some attention that if they didn't have their metrics, if we didn't use metrics, they'd be a bubble team. Is that something where you were making a point that they should be seen as a bubble team, or just kind of like, hey, this is the lack of quality wins that they have? What was the message behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, like, you look at just the nitty gritty, you look at Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. I mean, it's very similar to some of these, like Murray State, I guess, has a Q3 win, but some people would call them like a bubble team. Like it's kind of pointing out a little bit more so to like people, I think, focus maybe a little bit too much on just these Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, what that is involved a little bit too. But I mean, it is good that we have the metrics here to kind of like balance it out, because, in the RPI era, I don't know exactly what seed they would get. I don't think they're getting a top 6 seed. I think they'd be like maybe an 8, maybe a 9, maybe get where like Wichita State a couple of those years was like 10 seed and they were like clearly not. So I think the committee has done a better job looking at these analytical, metrics here. And, you certainly have with, strength of record, KPI, even like wins above bubble, which isn't on the team sheet, but I think the committee has, noted in the past, they've looked at that. I think it does point to a, good idea that you still have, a situation where they're looking at resume-based metrics that aren't just, wins, losses, and, Q1, Q2, all throughout. But yeah, in terms of this Houston team, I mean, I certainly haven't been impressed necessarily watching them, but at the end of the day, the resume, I think, speaks to them being like a 5 seed in the NCAA tournament. I think that's the right spot for them to be in. I won't be picking them to go far in my brackets, but they'll at least get like a 5 seed.
Yep, I think that's entirely fair. And you basically did my job for me, bringing up Murray State, because I think that's the transition I wanted to make here. Let's talk Murray State quick. We'll hit a few chat questions and then get out of here and let the people go watch some hoops tonight. But so Murray State, they got it done in the conference tournament. We were discussing pre-show with our producer about how you guys were a little, our 4 bracketologists here at Fielding 68, we're a little all over the place on the racers and trying to figure out where to place them. Lucas, I think that probably comes from being a mid-major team and not having the same kind of resume as some of the other squads. What do you think we should do with Murray State? And I guess 2 questions really there. What do you think the committee will do with them? And what would you prefer see done with them?
Well, I think your point is well phrased there. I think Murray State, it's just so hard to compare their resume with anybody else. And I think that's where the value of having 6 team sheet metrics it comes from. Is it's really hard to compare a team that's 5-1 and quad one and 2 with anybody else, because most of the teams that have 5 wins have played far more than 6 games. And is winning percentage really fair? Because I would not bet on Murray State being 10-2 if they played 5 more of those. I think that there's something to be said for looking into the metrics there. But I think that not just us as bracketologists for Fielding 68 are torn on it. I think metrics are even torn on it. For instance, Murray State is 45th in KPI, 18th in strength of record, the 2 resume metrics. Doesn't help all that much. They're 30th in BPI, they're 25th in KenPom. They're 66th in Sagarin, which doesn't really help us very much. Murray State's kind of a disaster to look at in terms of where they'll be seated. And I think they're probably the team that bracketologists come Selection Sunday are going to be the most either hit or miss on. And I think overall, though, we looked at probably the best mid-major last year was Loyola Chicago landing on the 8 line. I think Loyola Chicago had significantly better metrics than this year's Murray State team, but Murray State has a better record. And I think they'll probably both end up in that 8-9 kind of matchup. I could see Murray State getting as high as a 7, but I think they're pretty much in that 7-8 for me.
All right, Jonathan, what about you? Where do you see them? I brought up pre-show the 2019 Wofford team that was able to sneak up into the 7 line. Maybe some of the older St. Mary's teams would be okay comp, but they were also playing in a league with Gonzaga that wasn't quite the same as this Murray State team either. Where do you think the Racers should be at right now?
Yeah, I would say like the 6 to 7 line is where I would have them. I mean, look, the record is just fantastic, and we've mentioned the value of beating all these Q4 opponents. Murray State 17-0. So I mean, I guess that's not going to pop off the team sheet necessarily, but taking care of business against those teams is certainly an impressive job.
Have value.
Yeah. So I mean, and then like you also add in the fact that they played at Memphis early in the season. Maybe people thought that's a bad loss for Memphis. That's a bad loss for Memphis. And it actually is. Murray State's just really good. So I think, with this record, I think they're obviously going to get in, but I think they deserve to be, in the 6, in the 7 line, kind of like a couple teams I'll mention from that 2019 year was Buffalo, who I think kind of had a similar resume as a whole. They end up being a 6 seed. Then you compare them a little bit to that Wofford team that ends up being a 7 seed. So I think 6 or 7 seed is kind of where I see them being.
Yeah, I agree with that. Both Buffalo and Wofford that year ranked 23.3 exactly in quality metrics, which is kind of just a fun side effect. And this year's Murray State team ranked 40, which I think has me a little bit lower on the Racers, despite an outstanding record than perhaps those two teams in 2019.
Fair. Very fair. All right. There you have it. Let's hit a couple chat questions, guys. There are a couple questions about the Big East. First, from Jacob Pedruzzi, you don't have to go too long on these answers if you don't feel like it, but he says, does UConn's loss against Creighton, which is a road loss of Creighton Q1 game, does that hurt them seed-wise? Lucas, how do you see that one?
I don't think it hurts them too much. I think it probably rules them a little bit more on the hard to get to the 4 line for me. I think that they're definitely, behind that group of Illinois, Wisconsin, UCLA, Providence, and Arkansas as kind of a fringe 4 for me. I think the big difference there is I probably would have had UConn up on my 4 line had they won that game. Instead, I think they're pretty solidly on the 5 for me.
Okay, fair. The MC Lee, staying in the Big East here, Jonathan, said, can we talk about the teams in the middle of the Big East? Creighton, Seton Hall, Marquette. What are their ceilings? And I'm going to assume he's saying in terms of seed. Creighton obviously has the Nembhard injury they're dealing with. Marquette has been in a little bit of a swoon right now. So I guess let's start with Creighton there. If they prove at the Big East tournament they can win a couple more quality games without Nembhard, what do you think is their seed ceiling?
I would say maybe like a 9 seed or something like that. I think they're kind of locked into being, especially with kind of their low net ranking, they're only going to move up so much. So I think that, most likely they're going to end up being like a 10 or maybe like a early or one of the top 11 seeds. But I think they could move up potentially to a 9 seed if they make a run. But certainly I don't think they have that high of seed ceiling. I think the one of those teams that I kind of look at is, potentially making a run at being a 7 seed is Seton Hall. Like they have a, pretty clean overall resume, undefeated in Q3, Q4, those 6 quad 1 wins. They're 6-6 in quad 1, and that's kind of hard to do if you're not one of the elite teams. It certainly, I think, would be better than a lot of teams. Like I was also considering North Carolina for being a potential 7 seed. And you look at North Carolina, they're 2-7. So I think Seton Hall's Q1 record, they have pretty solid metrics. I think they're the highest ceiling team of those you mentioned.
Okay. Where do you stand, Lucas? Any of those teams have some high upside to get to in the Big East tournament?
Yeah, I already have Seton Hall on my 7 line. I have for about a week. I think that they can definitely get up to the 6. I like them probably pretty solidly to 7. And I think there's a pretty good chance that they end up avoiding that 8-9 game. They get Georgetown in their first Big East game, which a loss there would obviously be catastrophic for seeding and would probably plug them into the 8-9. But I think that winning there could kind of solidify their 7, just adding another W to the resume. I think they can get up towards the 6. I think there's a lot of that. I think there's a pretty big cutoff after my third 5, up through about the middle of the 9 line. And I think Seton Hall is certainly in the mix that could get there. Their resume metrics have climbed into the top 30. Their quality metrics are close to the top 30. Jonathan's already talked about 6 quad 1 wins for sure. I think Marquette definitely sliding Still 10 and 11 in quads 1 and 2, which is just an enormous quantity that I think, and 4 of those wins are in quad 1A. I think they're probably sitting on my 8-9, which they would obviously like to avoid either with a win or a loss. You don't want to face those 1 seeds. Creighton is a team that I think is probably going to get underseeded. Right now, the team is projected to make the field both by myself and the bracket matrix. They have the worst quality metrics by far. They're averaging 71st across those 3 metrics, where I think they could have a hard time getting closer to that. I think Jonathan's right with a 9 as a seed ceiling. I have them as my top 11 right now, and I think maybe they're sweating a little bit if they lose their first game of the Big East tournament, though I don't think they should. I think they have those resume metrics that I talked about with VCU and Davidson that are certainly on their side. But I think Creighton's probably going to be a double-digit seed.
I think that's reasonable. Yeah, the important thing for them was they showed they could win a big game without Nembhard. If they hadn't gotten that UConn one, there's a chance the committee could be like, this version of the team's not that good and leave them out. But that kind of solidified their case, and now it's mostly upside, I would think. All right. Last question, actually. Let's get to this one. From Tavius Cleaves, if Memphis wins the conference tournament, can they improve their seed? We'll just talk ceiling. How high up can they get, Jonathan? Is that a team that could get up to a 10 or all the way to an 8-9 game, or are they maybe locked into a double-digit seed?
Yeah, I mean, I think they certainly could. It of course depends on who they play, but theoretically they'll play SMU, another, fellow. I mean, I guess Memphis isn't on the bubble anymore, but like a top 50 team, they'll play Houston. If you're able to beat Houston 3 times in a row, you add that SMU win, you add in the, DeAndre Williams being out for some of those games early in the season. I think they could potentially get to an 8-9. Maybe they want to, lose to SMU for a 3rd time so they can avoid the 8-9 game, but I think they can get there.
Yep. Lukas, you agree?
Yeah, I already have Memphis on my 10 line. I think that they're in an interesting spot because I think you got to figure out, when we as bracketologists have no clue, how is the committee viewing Houston? Are they viewing Houston as a top 5 team in quality metrics and top 5 in the net, or are they viewing Houston as a 5 or 6 seed? Because I think that's very different in how they actually view Memphis's wins over the Cougars. If they think Houston is as good as their quality metrics say, then that's probably going to boost Memphis more towards the 8-9, and maybe even in contention for a 7 if they play well in the AAC tournament. If they view Houston as a 5 or 6 seed, and that's where Memphis's victory is, that's significantly worse than what Houston's quality metrics say. I think Memphis will then be pretty much stuck in a double-digit seed.
Very fair. I think that's a pretty strong answer. Gives a good picture of what the Tigers are looking at. Let's wrap up, guys. This is a terrific show. We've got a lot of basketball to be played over the next 6 days. We'll have another show on Friday to talk some of the big bubble results of Wednesday, Thursday, and even Friday morning. We'll have some results in by the time we're live at 6 p.m. Eastern, of course. So come back on Friday to tune in, get a little more of these guys talking their expertise. So thank you to Bet Rivers. Thank you to Field of 68 for letting us get on air and talk about this. And everybody that tuned in, we hope you enjoyed. Again, we'll be back on Friday. So for Jonathon Warriner, for Lukas Harkins, thank you everybody for tuning in, and enjoy the basketball.